Good evening. I'm Roger Hartley. I'm Dean of the College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore. On behalf of the ACLU of Maryland and the University of Baltimore College of Public Affairs, it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to our event that celebrates some incredibly important topics in civil rights and housing discrimination. We are celebrating tonight Lawrence Lanahan's terrific book, entitled The Lines Between Us, Two Families and a Quest to Cross Baltimore's Racial Divide. Briefly, the College of, and by the way, I wanted to say that this book is very much available at all of your favorite and special bookshops around the country. So highly recommended, and please buy it. The College of Public Affairs is Maryland's only college that's completely dedicated to public service and changing people's lives. We offer graduate and undergraduate programs in 3 schools: a School of Health and Human Services, a School of Criminal Justice, and a School of Public and International Affairs. And we have 2 world-class centers that also do education, research, and policy work: the Schaefer Center for Public Policy and also our Center for Drug Policy and Prevention. And as I say that, I wanted to say that the University of Baltimore and the College of Public Affairs is firmly and deeply involved in public engagement. And that is why it is my personal pleasure that we have this incredible panel event tonight, which is very much in the spirit of our engagement work at the University of Baltimore, but also our work in equity and inclusion leadership. A few words about the book. I'm also really excited that we're having this event because the book is centered here in Baltimore and also in our state of Maryland. Lawrence's book is broadly about the critically important topic of civil rights and housing discrimination in the 21st century. And beyond it being a locally centered book, it specifically looks at segregation and inequality in the Baltimore region from the Fair Housing Act to the death of Freddie Gray and also beyond. And of course, the subject matter is sadly so timely, and timely too on the heels of the verdict on Tuesday, and certainly the ongoing struggles that we face in equity and inclusion and racial discrimination in our country and around our world. But it's also special again to the ACLU of Maryland and the College of Public Affairs because of our engagement mission and our educational missions as well. Before introducing our partner in this incredible event, just a couple additional things. I wanted to point out some housekeeping. I'll be tonight serving as moderator, and I'll also be later fielding questions, but I wanted to kind of provide some important logistics. First of all, tonight's event is being recorded, and we do plan to find a way to release it to the public at a later time. The event, as you can see at the bottom of your screen, also is closed captioned. Each of the panelists tonight will speak for an assigned period. We will then give them time to respond to each other, and then we'll open it up for questions and conversation. And we should have, if I keep time really well tonight, we should have between 30 and 45 minutes for that question and conversation period for all of those of you who attended tonight. And we really, again, thank you for coming. I would ask on questions and conversation that you please wait until after all of our panelists have spoken, and please type all of your questions in the Q&A function, not the chat, the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom. That will help us actually field the questions and try to get them to the panelists. Certainly, though, feel free to use the chat to celebrate comments, to provide comments. We love that opportunity for people to interact with each other. And so at this point, I wanted to warmly introduce our partners, the ACLU of Maryland. I wanted to introduce Dana Vickers Shelly, who is the Executive Director of our ACLU of Maryland. I want to thank you, Dana, personally for the work of you and also your incredible staff for helping us make this event possible together tonight. And I'm just so excited to partner with you. But Dana, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you so much, Roger. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dana Vickers Shelly, Executive Director of the ACLU of Maryland, and I want to thank our co-sponsors from the University of Baltimore and our panelists for joining us for this important, urgent, and exciting conversation. You might remember that last year we invited you to a book talk and a panel discussion on the lines between us, and the event was going to take place in person on March 12th, 2020. I won't say any more about why we didn't meet last year, but here we are, and that's what's most important, because this discussion and bringing everyone together, even virtually, is so important. And we thank all of you, our participants, as well as our guests and attendees, for joining us. Tonight, we'll hear from journalist and author Lawrence Lanahan. His book, The Lines Between Us, looks at segregation and inequity in the Baltimore region from the Fair Housing Act to the death of Freddie Gray and beyond. The murder of Freddie Gray by Baltimore police. That history is centered around the story of Thompson v. HUD, a landmark civil rights lawsuit brought by the ACLU of Maryland in the early 90s, along with 14,000 Black families who lived in public housing. The case challenged longstanding segregation in public housing, and its remedy created thousands of living opportunities for residents of public housing throughout the Baltimore region. Tonight, I'm thrilled to welcome and introduce and see again Barbara Samuels, a ACLU of Maryland colleague, even though she claims to be retired. And we're excited to see her and be able to lift up the work that she led within our organization for many years. Barbara's the former managing attorney at the ACLU of Maryland for the Fair Housing Project. Thank you so much, Barbara. The Lines Between Us vividly focuses on the lives of real people in order to expose the structures and policies that perpetuate inequity in housing across America. One of those important people is Nicole Smith. Ms. Smith is a resident of Columbia, Maryland, who is a focus of the book. Her story and those of other individuals and families in the lines between us help us understand the current moment, about who gets to live where, what choices they're able to make, and how we can live justly together and equitably together. Thank you so much, Ms. Smith. It's so wonderful for you to be with us tonight. We'll also hear from Adria Crutchfield, Executive Director of Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. The BRHP is an organization that expands housing choices for families with low incomes who have been excluded from housing in well-resourced neighborhoods. The goal is to support families so they can thrive in the neighborhoods where they want to live. BRHP was launched in 2012 to administer the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program and other remedies following Thompson v. HUD lawsuit. As the administrator of the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, BHRP has helped over 5,000 families improve their quality of life as they search for new homes. Thank you so much, Adria. It's wonderful to see you again tonight. Every family deserves the resources they need to thrive. There is a continuing, evolving need to address America's legacy of systemic racism, which includes access to housing that is free from discrimination. Equitable access to housing is a civil right. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this evening for this important conversation. I look forward to it, welcome you, and thank you so much again for joining us. Let's get started.
Dana, thank you so much. Lawrence, you are on for 10 minutes.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm having a real before times moment here because all these people I'm looking at, I spent so much time with in real life, and it's been a long time, and having a sense of relief because we did want to do this on March 12th, 2020. The night before, we were still probably going to do it. We were talking about, oh, should we have hand sanitizer when I sign books, and maybe we'll skip the dessert reception. We all woke up and were immediately like, we can't do this. And that was the right decision, but it's just feels really good to be here with everybody. So thanks everybody for tuning in. A lot of work went into this event twice. And so to everybody at UB and ACLU of Maryland, thank you so much. for pulling it together. A lot's happened since March 12th, 2020. And as Black and Brown communities know, and people who have long been working to dismantle racial inequality and segregation know, COVID has been a giant I told you so. The disparate impact that this pandemic has had should have been obvious from the beginning. We've done too little too late. And the housing ramifications alone will take a long time to address. Um, I'll tell you a little bit about how I arrived at this book project, I guess. I started planning a series for WYPR, the public radio station in Baltimore where I used to work, about 10 years ago. It was going to be a series, year-long series about inequality, not just in Baltimore City, but the whole region. We ended up calling it The Lines Between Us. We did a lot of data mapping of inequality with our partners at UB, the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance at the Jacob France Institute. We did 50 episodes every Friday. We talked about this stuff on Maryland Morning. We talked about the deep structural issues that perpetuated segregation and racial inequality, how the lines between us shaped the housing market and created the racial wealth gap, how development around here left certain neighborhoods behind, how policing happened in Black neighborhoods, how race and class played out in public education. And we ended in 2013, in that October, with a public event around one question. It's a clunky wording that I put together, but it was, what tools do local, state, and federal government have to dismantle the drivers of structural inequality? So the series was just a detailed portrait of regional inequality. I left YPR right after the series and kept reporting on this stuff for national outlets. And eventually I realized it might be helpful to take a narrative approach to the issue. I wasn't going to ask anybody to listen to all 50 episodes of the series. And I wondered, how can I tell this story of the segregation and racial inequality in this region? Not just how it got that way. I mean, there's a lot of reporting about that, the history, but why it stays that way. And as a journalist, I had to narrow things down and find some characters, kind of show how this story was lived in our region. I had reported on Nicole Smith, one of our guests today. She had moved her son from West Baltimore to Columbia and Howard County for the schools and some other opportunities there. I'd also reported on a white couple, Mark and Betty Lang, who had moved from Bel Air out in Harford County to Sandtown in West Baltimore to live in solidarity with the Black poor out of their religious convictions. And I realized that by telling two stories of crossing the lines in opposite directions, that those lines might stand out in sharp relief, and that readers might feel the forces that push people in this region to either side of those lines. And I interviewed them about their family histories, and that really put things in context. It turned out that both Nicole's family and the Lang's families, they traced their arrival in Baltimore back to public housing. Both families did. Mark's granddad, moved up during World War II. He had flat feet. He couldn't fight, so he came out to Baltimore for a war job. He got housing in Brooklyn Homes, which was like de jure white at the time. And Nicole's mom moved up from South Carolina to Cherry Hill Homes, which we could talk about that for 5 hours, about why Cherry Hill was built where it was. But that was de facto Black at that time, although you could argue it was de jure. Anyway, the families, they didn't just have different trajectories in the way they came across those lines and moved around our region. They started from the same place. And it shows the power of whiteness and the power of structural racism in the region. So I also knew I needed one more thing to really pack a punch with this book, a really meaty story that would really leave a reader saying case closed about these forces that divide us, a story that would essentially diagram structural racism for the reader in a way completely particular to our region. I looked around, I reported on the Thompson versus HUD federal civil rights case. I looked around, and had anybody given this a book treatment, and I was surprised that it hadn't happened. And so I'll let Barbara sketch out Thompson for you. I mean, she helped file it. But what happened, the way I understand it, is that civic leaders in Baltimore and across the country, they were ready in the early 90s to tear down their high-rise public housing. And the Clinton administration was offering this program called Hope 6 that would replace them with low-income mixed income or low-rise mixed income housing. At that time, housing authorities were obligated to replace any decommissioned public housing units one for one. And you replace high rises with low rises, and you can see the math there. Like somebody's got to do something else. So this coalition came together in our region to push policymakers to consider the obligation of white and wealthy communities, the communities for whom this region was segregated. especially in the suburbs, consider their obligation to play a role in housing the region's poor, who had been crammed into the city and into the city's poorest and most segregated neighborhoods. Um, so Baltimore and the federal government had segregated public housing when they built it, and this lawsuit against the city, its housing authority, mayor, city council, and U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development (HUD) essentially said, "You're going to build again. Don't do it again. Don't segregate again 50 years later when you tear these towers down. You have an opportunity here to correct the history." And in the suit, the plaintiffs argued that the city and HUD had failed in their obligation to dismantle the remnants of segregation and discrimination that they had created in the decades past. The plaintiffs unearthed all kinds of documentation showing how that segregation and discrimination deliberately took place. So much, these advocates argued, had gone unrepaired. And the University of Baltimore's archives are amazing. They house the exhibits submitted by the plaintiffs and both defendants. It's stunning, and they've digitized it. And because this case went to trial, there are reams of depositions and courtroom testimony available at the federal courthouse downtown. And I can't tell you how much time I spent immersed in all this material. But what I can tell you is what I learned. To me, Thompson v. HUD is the crucible for the story of racial inequality and segregation in our region. It captures the different understandings people have of racism and discrimination. And it brings to light the distinctions that need to be made between intentional bigotry and discrimination and the policies that disproportionately harm the poor, harm people of color, harm Black people, even if policymakers have plausible deniability about any intentions to discriminate, and even if the people who benefit from those policies honestly don't understand them. Thompson v. HUD also shows how hard it is to try and dismantle segregation and concentrated poverty. You see the resistance in highly resourced majority white communities whenever anybody tries to get them to take their share of public or subsidized housing. And you see how hard it is to create opportunity and dismantle segregation in city neighborhoods. Thompson v. HUD brilliantly illustrates that Baltimore's problems are regional problems, not city problems. It shows how we got into this mess and why we're having so much trouble getting out of it. So I had the perfect case. How was I going to tell its story? I followed one character through it all, which is Barbara Samuels, who helped file the case and stuck with it through each of the 17 years that passed before its final settlement. I think, Barbara, it's fair to say you weren't thrilled about being the center of attention, partly because so many other advocates and residents had contributed so much. She told me about that all the time, how many other people were involved with this. But as a storyteller, I mean, she was part of every fair housing story I wanted to tell in the book, whether related to Thompson or not. Every time I interviewed somebody for like a magazine story or something about fair housing, we'd finish the interview and they'd be like, have you talked to Barbara? So I had to include Barbara. Barbara was part of a remarkable string of fair housing victories over the past 3 decades. And like I said, a lot of people worked with her along the way, a lot of lawyers, a lot of community activists, a lot of public housing residents, a lot of people simply caught up in the winds of injustice that blow so constant through this region. I suspect she'll tell you about these people. Many of them didn't make it into the book, which was hard to do. And it's just important that you know about them and don't forget about them. One major legacy of Thompson is its remedies. So there's a partial settlement to Thompson v. HUD in 1996. And in 2003, there was a trial. 2005, a judge found against HUD for failing to affirmatively further fair housing. And that led to a final settlement in 2012. It created a housing mobility program to help former public housing residents who wanted to move to more opportunity-rich parts of the region. Over 4,000 families have moved through the program. And I'm really happy we have 2 people here to share their experience regarding that. Adria Crutchfield runs the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership, and Nicole Smith moved to Columbia through this program. So thank you everybody for coming. And thanks to you being ACU of Maryland for inviting me to do this. Before I turn it over, I just want to say it's really important to me tonight that we connect these issues we're going to talk about, this decades-long struggle for fair housing, to what's happening right now in America. Segregation creates spaces that make it easy for police to abuse Black people with impunity. It also creates white spaces that draw on institutional mechanisms, whether law enforcement itself or exclusionary zoning, So essentially quarantine populations that they see as a threat to their wealth, if not their health. And the forces that we're going to talk about tonight created places like Ferguson, created places like Brooklyn Center, and Walter Mondale just died. He helped make the Fair Housing Act of 1968 a reality. Mondale envisioned, quote, truly integrated and balanced living patterns, unquote. We need to connect the dots between what the Walter Mondales wanted for America and what the Derek Chauvins have chosen for us.
Lawrence, thank you so much. And also I wanted to thank you for mentioning the University of Baltimore Archives, which is a spectacular place to find amazing history. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Next up, I'm really excited to introduce Barbara Samuels. As we heard earlier, not so retired from the ACLU of Maryland. And Barbara, I can't thank you enough for being with us tonight, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. And I am endeavoring to be retired, but I'm very happy. This was a piece of unfinished business from last year. And, I think we were all really excited about the response and disappointed when we had to pull the plug on it, but for obvious reasons. So Lawrence gave a great introduction, I think, to Thompson and the legal campaign. I think it's worth saying that when Thompson started, when I came to the ACLU, this was in the period around 1993. The organization was undertaking not just this huge public housing desegregation case to address segregation in the Baltimore region, but it was part of a sort of a three-legged stool. At almost exactly the same time, the ACLU filed a case to get equity in school funding. That's the Bradford case, which eventually influenced the Thornton funding formula, and more recently, the Kirwan funding formula, and which is still an ongoing major effort to try to get more equitable funding for Baltimore City schools. And then the third leg of the stool was undertaking to reform some of the more egregious of the Baltimore City Police Department arrest policies, where under sort of zero tolerance, everybody could be and was arrested, it seemed, in the Black neighborhoods of Baltimore. And so this was a mighty ambitious undertaking. And I doubt any of us really realized how ambitious it was when we started, but it did become obvious. So as Lawrence said, the purpose of the housing leg of Thompson was to attack the institutional structures of segregation in the region that were causing, or at least deepening, these other problems in areas like schools and school funding, school segregation, arrest policies, and oppressive police practices. And, there are really two sides to segregation and its harms, both of which really became apparent in the last year. So one is what became the focus of Thompson in particular, which is exclusion from well-resourced neighborhoods and opportunity hoarding by white people in segregated white affluent spaces. And that has been a large part of the focus of the remedies under Thompson and the other two cases that we brought, one against the state and its policies regarding where low-income housing tax credit projects are built, and Baltimore County, which of course had a long-standing policy of excluding public housing, excluding and even expelling Black residents of Baltimore County from the county. And but the other side of exclusion is that segregation, as Lawrence said, makes it possible to do things like target particular neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods, for militarized and oppressive police practices, for disinvestment, to starve them of resources, and to in many ways treat those neighborhoods worse than white neighborhoods. And so, we see that obviously, with Freddie Gray's arrest on such specious grounds, you would never see someone arrested on those grounds if they were in Roland Park or Canton instead of in Sandtown. Stop and frisk policies in the what has been called by Professor Kianga Yamhata Taylor in her book, Race Profits, predatory inclusion. In other words, predatory loan practices that took place in Black neighborhoods. And this year, as we've seen, unequal health conditions. So the Thompson did not focus as it went forward as much on that side of the segregation equation, in large part because the judge early on in the case dismissed the part of the case that sought to equalize conditions in Black and white neighborhoods based on a motion that was filed by the city. Ironically, one of the first things that the city did in the case was to get the claims for remedies to equalize resources and conditions in Black neighborhoods thrown out. But these are two sides of the same coin. They are not, exclusion and disinvestment are not in tension with each other. They are really two sides of the same coin of segregation, and they require a joint coordinated attack. So of the two sides of the coin, historically, there's probably been more attention paid to projects like the Sandtown Transformation Project in the 1990s, or the East Baltimore Project that sought to redevelop Black neighborhoods or invest in Black neighborhoods, but were what we would call place-based remedies. And we're focused on place, not necessarily people. They were not necessarily geared towards helping the people who had been the original residents there. They were more geared towards improving the places. And there have been really very few real efforts in Baltimore that have really coordinated the attack on exclusion with people-based approaches to place-based remedies. That was something that we tried to do in Thompson in dealing with the question of the high rises, which Lawrence addressed. Pursuant to Thompson, Baltimore became the first city in the country that demolished all of its high-rise housing, and people who maybe are newish to Baltimore, and by that I mean maybe 15, 20 years or younger, probably don't even remember when there were high-rise public housing projects on either side of downtown. A big part of the work on Thompson was trying to redevelop those sites in a way that would promote economic integration, if not always racial integration. And I guess I would characterize those efforts or those results as being mixed at best, where we have had, some success that is beyond what I probably would have imagined possible, and which I think I will leave to Adria and Nicole to describe in more detail, is addressing the exclusion side of segregation. Again, something that heretofore had been given relatively little attention. One thing about place-based remedies is a lot of white people can support them because they don't really impact them. It's something that happens over here in this other neighborhood. It's very different when you're talking about building affordable housing in a white suburban neighborhood to provide, greater opportunities for people and greater housing choices. But I think it's really a serious question that Professor Taylor asks in Race Profits, whether you can succeed at place-based development without also addressing the exclusion aspects. And that's an area where I'm gonna try to end on a really high note here. There are huge opportunities in front of us that I wouldn't have thought maybe were possible a few years ago. So I'll just briefly mention a couple things. One is the Biden administration, in addition to reviving the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that Obama enacted and Trump and Dr. Carson killed, has a plan for addressing exclusionary zoning. And that plan entails more of a carrot than a stick approach at this point, but it's providing incentives, funding incentives to jurisdictions that eliminate or reduce their exclusionary zoning. That is huge. The second is expansion of the housing voucher program, which is the biggest program that the federal government has for helping people afford their housing. And the value of that program has become crystal clear in the last year, if it hadn't been already, as we've been facing a potential eviction tsunami as people lost their jobs and livelihood during the pandemic. People with vouchers have maintained housing stability because as your income goes down, the amount of assistance you get goes up. So the Biden platform includes making housing vouchers universally available to people who are in the income group that qualifies for vouchers. Only about a quarter get that now. And that's the bread and butter of the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, is it uses these vouchers. And also the provision of mobility assistance. And so there's a good down payment in the Biden budget that's been proposed so far to help expand the voucher program and mobility counseling. So this is sort of a real earthquake and shift. COVID is part of it. The housing shortage and rising prices for millennials, I think, has really highlighted the housing issues and made it more politically salient. Books like The Color of Law, as well as Lawrence's book, really led to an awareness of redlining and the government's role in causing segregation. The academic research has really shown pretty much beyond dispute now that housing and neighborhood conditions really matter, especially for children. And last but not least, the movement over the last year, or the escalation of the movement for racial equity and social justice over the last year has really elevated all these issues. So I'll stop there for now, and we can get into more stuff in the Q&A.
Barbara, thank you so much. Next up, we have Miss Nicole Smith, whose lived experience is featured in the book. And Nicole, welcome, and we're excited to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. Hello, everyone. Hi, Mr. Lawrence, my friend, and Miss Barbara, and everyone else on the call. And hello to all the viewers. As they mentioned, my name is Nicole Smith. Sorry if you see me looking down, but I had my notes ready. My name is Nicole Smith, and I am a participant in the BRHP program, Housing Mobility. My experience with the program has been life-changing, but moving to a new area, it's like my life started over. I came from the city, as Lawrence and Barbara mentioned. I came from the city and I moved all the way to, well, not all the way, but I moved to Columbia, Maryland. A little background about me. I'm a single mom, I'm engaged. I'm a professional educator and I'm an entrepreneur. I grew up in many areas around Baltimore, as they mentioned, Cherry Hill, Westport, Murphy Homes. I also lived in the Adria Hill area with my mom and two sisters. I moved to Columbia with the help of the voucher program. It was formerly known as MBQ back in 2009. Violence is not invisible. Violence is not invisible. It can happen anywhere. I grew up in areas where crime happened a lot. Nevertheless, I commend my mom for raising her three kids, in those type of rough communities. She will always have different adventure plans for us. Like during the weekend, we will probably go to the zoo or go to the mall, Enchanted Forest, if anyone remember that. We will go to DC, we will go to Pennsylvania, or in the summertime, we will go to South Carolina. So we was always out of the community. Although we lived in the community, we didn't get to really experience the rough areas, rough events that happened around there. I know some days, back to my mom, because she's mentioned in the book as well. I know some days it wasn't easy for her to raise us. Being a divorced mom, working long hours to take care of us. And as I mentioned, she's mentioned in the book, and you can get more background story of that in the lines between us. About Columbia, living in Columbia was a change of scenery for us, for me and my son. One thing for certain, I was exposed to allergies. Living around more trees and grass, I was exposed to allergy. My son and I moved into this apartment where we currently reside for 12 years. I have not moved yet. Many issues occurred with my leasing office. Actually, living here, we had battles in courts for some years until the new company that took over the complex dropped the entire case. So that was that. Then my son, when we moved here, my son was in the second grade. When we moved here, he was in the second grade. I was a student at Baltimore City Community College, and I was also employed there at the child care campus that's on site, that's on the campus there. A few years later, when I moved here, I started attending Howard Community College. Later graduated in 2014. Leaving my longtime church in Baltimore, I found a new church in Columbia. I worked multiple jobs, including Head Start and Columbia Association before and after care. Also, I was very active in my son's school, and I was part of the PTA. So moving into a new area, not knowing anyone, being part of the PTA and working and joining the church, it helped me form the circle of friends. So years later, in 2013, my mom said to me, you should open, and I'm doing all this while I'm in the MBQ program. My mom said to me, you should open a childcare. So my mom did run a childcare 20 years ago, back when I was around 7 or 8, she opened up her childcare. So then the following year, I graduated with the AA in early childhood development and opened Nicole's Fun and Learning Family Childcare in 2014. So a little bit about my son. Fast forward up to in high school, he attended JRTC. He's a current student now, a full-time student at HCC studying criminal justice. He's employed and he hopes to transfer to a school in California by next year. And he's thinking between being a police or military at this point. So, and then one of my goals I want to mention, being in this program, by help me getting my credit straight, I am looking into home buyer, being a home buyer, because I've been in this program for quite a while. The policy in BRHP is helpful, and it played a vital role helping me to manage my finances. However, the income adjustment can be a little nervous sometimes, because they go by your income, which is still great, especially, can I say this, especially with now having a business and the corona happened, my income dropped. So thankfully, the MBQ kind of helped me with that part. So BRHP locates family in better environments. You hear Ms. Barber and Mr. Lawrence talk about the communities in the city. So with BRHP, I have to get used to saying that. I'm used to MBQ. They put you in better environments and opportunities in certain areas in the county. With that said, I'm grateful. My son was able to live in a community with less violence and no street corner scenery. I want to mention the book, The Lines Between Us. It shares a lot of my journey from a little girl attending Trey Hill. Lived in South Carolina for a year. My 9th grade year, I came back home and graduated from Frederick Douglass High School. From there, I went to West Virginia State College for a couple of years. And the book stopped around 2017. So what it doesn't mention is where I currently have my paralegal certificate. I'm excited about that. So life is still moving on. I'm still becoming successful. And that's it. That's the line between the city and the county and my family. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciated the West Virginia State reference. I grew up 7 miles from there, actually. So it was really nice to hear. Next up, we have Adria Crutchfield, who is the Executive Director of the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. Adria, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Looking forward to hearing from you as well.
Thank you, Roger. It's great to be with you all tonight. I feel very privileged, honestly, to be leading the organization that is responsible for carrying out the settlement of a historic fair housing lawsuit brought by the ACLU on behalf of folks like Ms. Nicole Smith, and to be carrying out that work still today. So just a little more detail about the work that we do. So as you've heard, BRHP helps families access and transition successfully to neighborhoods that are safe, healthy, and economically vibrant. We serve 4,300 households within the Baltimore region. Those households are comprised of 14,000 individuals, and over half of those are children, so 17 years of age or younger. And we administer both rental assistance in the form of the Housing Choice Voucher, and we couple that with rental housing counseling or mobility counseling supports to those families. And we do this in a couple of staged ways. We families enroll who choose to enroll with us. Families enroll in a series of workshops as we prepare them to become lease ready for the private market. A lot of our families are transitioning from very high poverty neighborhoods. They might be coming from public housing, a different type of environment, different housing stock, different even owner-tenant situation in some instances. And so we work with them on goal setting and banking and budgeting, as Ms. Smith referenced, helping with some financial coaching, helping to repair or restore credit, helping families understand what opportunity areas are and the amenities that are available to them and their children, helping them to understand or how to, what they might encounter in terms of a new, what I like to call property partner and tenant relationship. And so, for instance, if you're coming from public housing owned by the Housing Authority of Baltimore City, and you're going to a standalone townhome, those are very different living situations and have different expectations around, for instance, cutting the grass or taking out the trash. And so we help prepare families for those types of things. And then once families have made it through the workshops, we issue the voucher, and we continue to assist them in the housing search. That pre the pandemic consisted of housing tours, so not just visiting the actual units, but taking tours of these whole communities. And those areas of opportunity are within the city of Baltimore and then the 5 surrounding counties. And then we stay in touch with the family for 2 years once they have decided where they would like to live, and a series of post-move counseling support services. And so we visit them again. Pre-pandemic, we were visiting homes. Post-pandemic, we do our visits virtually, and we are helping to ensure children are enrolled in the new schools and that the family is adjusting to their new settings smoothly. So those are some of the mechanics around how this Baltimore Housing Mobility Program works. And we've been doing that, as you heard, for quite a while. And prior to the nonprofit being formulated, yes, the administrator was a private entity called MBQ, which is referenced in the book. So I don't actually think BRHP shows up in the book, but the MBQ then became the Baltimore Regional Housing Partnership. And I would encourage you all to get to know a little bit more about our organization by visiting the website, brhp.org. I'll be sure to drop that in the chat. That is the bulk of our work, however, not the only work that we're doing. We're also big advocates in terms of ensuring that our families have access in lots of different ways, and that we are assisting them with their economic mobility, with their economic resiliency, with understanding their rights as tenants, ensuring that they have more access to more neighborhoods. And so we were working in coalition with a number of other organizations around the source of income protections that were finally passed at the state level last year. And we will continue to advocate on a number of federal fronts, which I think we will probably get into later in the discussion. So thank you again for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much, Adria. So next, we'd really like to have a conversation, and wanted to start that conversation up by allowing the panelists to react to each other's comments or ask each other questions. And then after that, we've already have at least one question in the Q&A, and I have some others. And I would invite all those attending, if you are interested in asking a question, please put it in the question and answer function at the bottom of the Zoom. And I'm enjoying reading the chat and all of the nice comments to our panelists, by the way, too. So you may use chat to comment in any way. Any reactions, panelists?
I don't have anything.
I'm interested, Adria, just kind of to hear more about Biden has some big dreams. And I wonder what part BRHP, could play in that. I mean, if Biden does what you'd like to see him do, like, what are you guys going to be doing?
What will you be doing? We're very unique in that we are a nonprofit organization that functions partly like a housing authority, in that we are administering a voucher program. And to the degree that the Biden administration expands the voucher program, as it is indicated that it desires to do, and hopefully Congress will follow suit, I think we're in a really unique position to facilitate the administration of additional vouchers, and specifically share our practices around voucher administration and mobility counseling with other housing providers. So again, for instance, helping families with their search, that is so critical. And a lot of housing authorities simply issue vouchers and send a family on their way. And we take the time to ensure that the family is going to be successful with that voucher and is aware of, they have more choices than just what might be right in front of them, or just the predatory landlord that's hanging out outside the housing authority that knows, that folks are kind of under strict time constraints to find housing quickly before the voucher expires. And we have been doing this work for a number of years and have a lot of best practices to share. And we have actually been sharing those with other housing authorities across the country and jurisdictions who have demonstrated an interest in administering their rental assistance programs or their housing choice voucher programs in a similar way that we are administering ours. So I would say we will be advocating for sure for the expansion because the voucher program only serves about 1 in 4 people who actually would be eligible based on just their income. And providing, consulting services, technical assistance, and again, just best practices to those who we know are likely to see increases in their voucher allocation if the program was to be expanded. Additionally, we do a lot of outreach to private owners of the properties because this program doesn't work without owners leasing to our families. And so we've been really, I think, innovative in our outreach in terms of orienting new property partners to the Housing Choice Voucher Program. How does it work, ensuring that they understand the mechanics of how they get paid and how they get paid at the same time every month reliably, and how, as Barbara mentioned, if someone's income goes down, well, our subsidy goes up. And so their full market rent is going to be met with our help. Additionally, helping them to understand the laws around source of income protection. We also help with marketing of their properties. So, for instance, in the mobility program that we administer here, if you have a property that you'd like to lease out and it's in an opportunity area, and we have our opportunity area defined on our website, you can visit our opportunity map. We are happy to, take your listing and highlight it on our social media platforms, as well as make sure that our families with vouchers know that your unit is available. And so we do unit referrals directly to those seeking housing. So we would continue, honestly, Lawrence, to do a lot of the same work we do, but I think to a wider swath of the landscape.
Right. There's a new-ish book called The Voucher Promise by sociologist Eva Rosen. And I got to talk to her when the book came out. And she makes this interesting point in the book, which is that if you own a house, like, you get the mortgage interest deduction, no problem. Everybody gets it. But if you're a renter and you want some, help via a housing choice voucher, yeah, like a quarter or a third of people get it. And so it sounds like this huge deal, like, we're going to make that thing universal. And the big deal is like, it wasn't universal.
Yeah, I would just add to what Adria said. I mean, I think in terms of where the Biden administration and housing policy is going and BRHP's role in that, a lot of what's going on the federal level is really modeled after BRHP's program. So BRHP was not the first housing mobility program, but it has been probably it is definitely one of the biggest that has shown at scale how housing mobility works, and also how the housing voucher program can be improved to make it more user-friendly for families and also for landlords and also for housing authorities. And so BRHP has innovated in a lot of ways that have become a model for some of the policy proposals on the federal level, one of which is a bill sponsored by our own Senator Chris Van Hollen, to target vouchers to families with young children, who are in that critical development period of early childhood.
Very research-based.
Yes, very much grounded in the research and in the experience of BRHP in showing that it works, because that is what BRHP does. It targets in particular families that have at least one young child. And so BRHP and also partners in Dallas and Chicago are working together to provide technical assistance to other housing authorities around the country to adopt this model. And Congress has funded it the last 2 years, so that there's actually going to be an announcement sometime this summer of expanding the program to 5 or 10 at the most at this point, probably other cities. So I think that's, in addition to the extent to which BRHP has had success in Baltimore, I think it's really reverberated nationally. And that's really important, because one of the things that people used to say about housing segregation was, yeah, okay, we know the government, purposefully segregated public housing. We know about redlining and so on, but geez, it's just so hard to do anything about it. We just don't know what works. We don't have that excuse anymore. We know what works.
It was fascinating writing this part of the book. This is one of the threads in the book, was housing mobility. One, because as it's engaging as a writer to find the narrative and historical threads of things. So going back through the old archives and finding the organizers in Baltimore start to build toward what would become Thompson. But you go back to the Gautreaux case in Chicago. I mean, that is what pioneered this. Is Chicago got sued, they created this program and moved thousands of families out to the suburbs. So like Baltimore, like behind the scenes, was learning from Chicago before Thompson was filed. MBQ comes, and then it was really interesting to research and write about BRHP because it was such a big remedy, and Baltimore was in the vanguard with this. Like BRHP was doing interesting stuff, like, we're working so close with these families. It's clear that like driver's ed or like help them get a car. Like we got to help them with transportation. So like they would get these little grant funded things to like deal with that. You know, counseling for their second move. Like they think about moving again. It's helpful for us to be there when they make that decision. So watching you guys evolve, and it was really interesting going from like Dundalk and Hamilton, where like white people were just so red in the face over the idea of this, and like suddenly housing mobility is a bipartisan poverty solution during the Trump administration. I may be overstating that, but I'm certainly overstating that. But to watch this evolve, and Barbara always tells me, she's like, people, you hear from people before people move, you don't hear about it after. And so this has become such a part of the way housing is done now. It's really interesting to watch. And I mean, I stopped reporting in 2017. So if somebody wants to write the lines between us too, I mean, you could probably do it already just with what's happened in the last 3 years along that thread.
Oh, thanks. Just a couple comments. One is I was really struck by and excited to hear about the work that you're doing, Adria, with owners. And I recall, and this has been a couple years ago, so things may have changed, but I recall a New York Times story focused on Atlanta. And one of the concerns is that there were not enough owners that were accepting vouchers, and that was a worry, at least in that region. The other thing I thought about that was pretty great, and I have to plug a local organization that I work with called Live Baltimore. But the idea that in Baltimore we want people to stay in Baltimore too. So how the vouchers work within the city as well, which I know they do, but helping people find homes in other parts of the city is so important to cities like Baltimore, where we have received really big problems from flight of our own residents. So it's really an interesting discussion on vouchers. But one thing I really wanted to do is we have 11 really great questions from our participants tonight, and wanted to try to bounce into some of those. We're doing great on time. We have 30 minutes left, but one of the early questions I think was for you, Barbara, but perhaps anyone. Is litigation possible against HUD for its past redlining in Baltimore? And they explain by saying plaintiffs would be homeowners of color whose homes were worth less than equivalent homes in predominantly white neighborhoods because of HUD's past redlining.
Wow. So, of course, the official policy of redlining predated HUD as an agency, but there have been, and I think a court is going to say the statute of limitations has run. It's, time with the passage of time, that actually became an issue in Thompson as well. But there have been subsequent waves of harms that have been visited on Black neighborhoods in Baltimore and elsewhere. I think sometimes redlining has become a shorthand for many different forms of housing discrimination, segregation, and predatory practices. These things are still ongoing in many ways. So, for instance, it is most of these Black neighborhoods in Baltimore are what some people have called lending deserts now. There are almost no owner-occupant loans made by banks to these neighborhoods. That's changed a little bit, in the pandemic real estate frenzy. So I think, the key thing is to focus on some of the more current practices. And, one of those was during the prior housing crash in, the boom in the early 2000s and then the crash in 2008. The city did sue Wells Fargo for some of their predatory lending practices that led to foreclosures for many homeowners and additional expenses for the city. So, that was a pretty creative lawsuit. I think there are other different lawsuits that are possible, but with the, I would say with that caveat that these types of lawsuits are not easy. The law is not, the courts are not friendly places these days, especially with the recent appointees. Cases can be very expensive to bring. So it's no small thing to challenge systemic, practices of racism in the housing market. And, I think that's one of the big valuable contributions that the ACLU made in undertaking such a big project, probably much bigger and longer lasting and expensive than was contemplated at the beginning.
Thanks. Another question in the chat from Steve to all. Does anyone have inspirations or thoughts about the future of integration upon race and income from this? And notes kind of as a comment, Nicole is the closest to that environment from moving to Columbia, but the rest of the region still seems to be fighting any mixing of race and income. General thoughts on that and to any panelist.
I mean, I don't like to make integration too much of an end in itself. It's, I live in a community that's integrated on paper, in Hamilton and Northeast Baltimore, but does that do a damn thing for the Black families who live here? We had a long conversation about that at a book event at the public library here in Hamilton. The answer is not necessarily always. So to me, it's that is a valuable goal. It's more about creating the choice. And I mean, I know that Barbara and Adria, you guys talk about this sometimes. You're not like picking up people and like putting them where they're supposed to be. It's making sure that there is people have their civil rights, that they have, if they are using, this subsidy, they have fair housing choices wherever they want to go, and that these that the white communities aren't closing ranks and keeping people out. So I mean, the statistics are there for the dissimilarity index as far as whether this region is integrating or not. But for me, it's like, even if it's integrating, is there equity? Is there justice? Are people feeling welcome where they are? Is the integration creating opportunities and networks for people to thrive? But Eva's book talks about bridging. Like, even in Park Heights, which is mostly Black, you see a disconnect between the homeowners and the renters, and the civic associations tend to cater to the homeowners. So I feel like integration is a great thing on paper, and it's a valuable aspiration, like Mondale talked about. But man, like, I remember the morning after Baltimore kind of rebelled on April 27th, 2015. I had just moved to Hamilton 6 months earlier, and I remember walking around the neighborhood just being like, I live in an integrated neighborhood. What does that mean for Black families,
Well, integration, people sometimes think is like, oh, it's, who you're living next to. And it's not that. It is about choice, and that is, as choice is a civil right. But it's also about making it more difficult for opportunity hoarding by whites to occur in neighborhoods that maintain themselves as exclusively white, and giving people of color and Black people in particular access to the resources that have been hoarded in those neighborhoods and from which they have been excluded. So, as Professor John Powell would say, and he was one of our expert witnesses, segregation is really about separation from resources, and integration is really about access to resources.
Thanks. I have a question for Nicole. Question is, why did you choose Columbia, and what are your thoughts when you return to Penn North?
Oh, wow. Okay. How do you know that person that was from Penn? I lived in Penn North. So they must have read Mr. Lawrence's book. But or I didn't mention Drew Hill. I chose Columbia first. First off, I always known of Columbia. So that was like the first. Actually, I didn't look anywhere else. I looked in Columbia. I rode around. And it's so funny because the way Columbia is designed, you really have to go into neighborhoods to see what other communities are out there. So I only saw like the outskirts of things. So that's why I ended up where I'm at. Then after living here for about a year, I was like, wow, I could have moved. I could have looked at this neighborhood. I could have looked over there, So I chose Columbia, and because that's what I know. And then I did my when I had started in a program at the time, they did like tour buses, right? We got on a bus and we took a tour to different communities. And they gave us the history of each community. I know we went here, Howard County, PG, Montgomery. We did like 5 counties, I'll say, in one day. And they gave us the history, and they was giving us examples, like, look at this school, they on one floor. Look at the communities, and this, like, it was the different things that they said about the community. I said, okay, I would just choose community, Howard County. And I have liked it since I've been here. And what was the second part?
Second
like
part,
when you go back to your old neighborhood.
Oh, when I go back, okay, when I drive through most times, because I don't know when that's still there, but when I drive through, everything looks the same. My house is still there that we lived in. No one moved in there. It's still the same. I believe, I want to say the Freddie Gray situation was in that area, and I believe they burnt down the CVS. And I haven't been through here in a while. So one day when I was in the city, I was like, let me drive through to see how it looked. And I was really surprised to see the CVS burnt down. But people were still outside, and I saw the writings on the wall. But you know, I never be ashamed where I came from. I still love my city, and I still visit my city. I'm still in my city a lot of times. I just haven't been in Drew Hill because I don't know anybody that lived there, you know, for me to visit and really walk around and see, shake hands with people and see what's really going on. I just know by when I go through it, and it's still the same. But I wish they would fix up the homes, because it looked like a lot of homes are now abandoned. They all boarded up compared to when we lived on that street. It was people and mostly all the houses. So I wish they would rebuild that community over there, and I think it would probably look a little bit more, you know, want to be. I can't think of the term, but want to live there. You know, get what I'm saying? Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole. There's a question.
Roger,
Oh, go ahead,
Roger,
please.
if I could, just for a quick second, I think what Nicole has highlighted is just really important in terms of we need policy solutions and actions that both, you know, help someone today and address the urgent need, but that also, you know, are allocating resources to areas that also need it. And I think that can come in the form of, you know, some of the place-based work and restoring neighborhoods, but it can also come in the form of the renter's tax credit, direct cash assistance to those folks that live there. That's another way to invest in people that are in Ms. Smith's old neighborhood, for example. And I just want to emphasize my strong belief that we have to be doing both. We have to be providing solutions such as, you know, mobility counseling that addresses the need right now, and also the reinvestment or the resource allocation in the areas that Ms. Smith left.
Thanks so much. We have a question from Benjamin. Beyond housing, what roles have public transportation played in the segregation of Baltimore, as well as the placement and development of major roads and highways within our city?
Who wants to talk about the red line?
Yeah, there's another red line we haven't talked about. The
Right,
red line
right.
that Governor Hogan.
The not redlining.
Right. I think that's so critically important to discuss, and it absolutely, I think, we can't just talk about housing as the only way to address economic resiliency or poverty issues. It definitely takes a comprehensive approach, and transportation being so key. And I think that was such a racist act by the governor to have defunded that.
It's big. I don't know where the NAACP's suit stands, but I mean, basically, if you don't know about this, the short version is like under O'Malley as governor, the city and the state put all this money in, got federal money, planned a new light rail line to go all the way from Social Security and Woodlawn over to Bayview, right across like Black East Baltimore and Black West Baltimore. Could have created all this economic development, and Hogan, like weeks after Freddie Gray's death, just like shut it down. And so NAACP sued over, I think it was a disparate, Barbara, was a disparate impact?
Yeah,
May as
actually,
well have been.
that was the NAACP and the ACLU
And the
filed
ACLU, okay,
an
sorry.
administrative complaint with the Department of Transportation during the Obama administration, which, you know, they kind of dragged their feet on a little bit. And then, of course, Trump came in and was promptly dismissed. But you know, the new secretary, Secretary Pete, has been saying a lot of the right things about understanding the role that transportation played in destroying and harming Black neighborhoods the way the Highway to Nowhere did in Baltimore.
Literally knocking them down.
Right, as well as, you know, inequitable provision of transportation, and they just put a halt to review a highway in Houston that was going to go through a Black and Latino community there. So, you know, cautiously optimistic that they're going to take the non-discrimination requirements of federal law in federally funded projects seriously for kind of the first time. But, you know, if you look at our region, Carroll County actually has a county resolution that prohibits transit from Carroll County to any other county and from any other county into Carroll County. So they still want to get lots of state funding for other things, but not for transit that could go from like the end of the subway in Owings Mills out to jobs in, you know, Westminster. And generally MTA services outside of the Beltway are pretty sketchy.
Next time you're taking the light rail down to an O's game from the county and you're kind of like tooling around without a stop past Ruxton, you ask yourself why Ruxton doesn't have a light rail stop. There's an intersection there with plenty of jobs, but it doesn't have a light rail stop.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, the big problem is that, you know, during the period when the suburbs were developed and, you know, white people were assisted with government FHA loans to move out to the suburbs, and jobs also moved out to the suburbs, and highways made it easy for people to move out to the suburbs and commute if they had jobs in the city. You know, this huge decentralization of the population and resources and infrastructure and jobs excluded the Black population in Baltimore City. You know, if you can't get there, you can't get access to those jobs. And that is still a problem. That is an ongoing problem because most of the job growth is outside of the city.
Yeah, and those, I mean, think of the JFX and highways like that were built during suburbanization as the channels through which wealth follows whiteness. And think about when you get down JFX and it turns into a street, turns into President Street. That is exactly where Fox 45 has their cameras so their white viewers can flip out about squeegee boards. There's a reason those young men go to the very spot where the highway turns into a street.
Well, two comments on that. Also, with the JFX and other roads like it around the country that divided neighborhoods off, where to the left and to the right, you have absolutely different levels of poverty and inability for people to access parts of the city. And those jobs that you mentioned, Barbara, I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Seema Iyer, who is here or was here, who leads the Baltimore Neighborhood Indicators Alliance. But she did a really terrific opinion piece based on data from BENIA, noting some of what you said, Barbara. The highest commute times within city from house to job are in West Baltimore. And there is a direct correlation between economic vitality and mobility of a person when their commute time is shorter versus longer. And that red line, of course, what Seema said very well, as I recall in that piece, was going to vastly shorten those commute times from West Baltimore to downtown and also to East Baltimore. And that is one of the biggest and saddest legacies of discrimination in our city, is the inability, like you said, Barbara, to get to work and to get home with your families and to your families afterwards.
So, I used Seema's research for a story I did in the Urbanite in 2015. I followed a housekeeper. This woman is a housekeeper at GBMC Hospital in Towson. She lives on Fulton Street in Sandtown. I went out to the bus stop at 4:30 in the morning with her to do her commute from Sandtown, the 6 miles as the crow flies, to Towson to work as a housekeeper at GBMC. And it's pretty epic commute.
Yeah, and of course, this is so closely related to housing exclusion, because you would, you know, sound planning principles would tell you as jobs were decentralizing, the affordable housing should have decentralized also. That did not happen.
And she had a Habitat for Humanity house in Sandtown, which really helps. But not when you got to take the bus for an hour and 15 minutes.
Yeah. So I will say this, that, you know, as a result, you know, some of the cases that we filed against the state and against Baltimore County have been resulting in some turning of the aircraft carrier around on the exclusion of affordable housing from those suburban areas. So the next funding round after we settled the case against the state with requirements to change their criteria and give incentives for development of affordable housing for families in suburban opportunity areas, which was something that the state had said, well, we don't do that because the developers aren't interested. We don't get any applications, blah, blah, blah. Just within that single year of the funding round, they got applications for 807 units of affordable housing in suburban opportunity areas in one single year. So it's a long slog, but I will say that I think that this process is showing again that we know what to do. It's not that we don't know what to do. It's that we lack the political will in many cases to do it.
Let's talk about the risk of doing these things too, because I was giving these talks in fall of 2019, right? And we were talking about, hey, Minnesota's getting rid of single family only zoning and Howard County's redistricting their schools. And I was telling these stories about like when Howard County tried to move students around to make some schools less crowded, they also did it in a way that no school would be more than like 45% poor students. And the superintendent got a death threat from a white student at one of the whitest, most wealthy schools in Howard County when Baltimore County Council voted to create source of income discrimination protections, which they had voted against in 2016. They needed 2 council people to switch their votes. And those council people said, yeah, we're thinking about switching our votes. And they were under police protection during that whole process of the hearings and the vote. So like, what I say about this is before that happened, I said, if you try to dismantle structural racism, it's going to be cataclysmic. And I was saying in 2019, like everything's cataclysmic. You might as well, and that was before what happened in 2020. But what you discover is that if you take a board off the house of structural racism, white supremacy just flashes out from beneath. It is a risk to really challenge some of these structures. You'll see that it is not just people that don't have a racist bone in their body and don't follow politics, and like so it just perpetuates itself. Things happen. It gets scary when you really try to dismantle these structures.
Yeah, I do want to say about that though, that NIMBYism and some of this resistance and so on is heavily rooted in fears of the unknown. And once the affordable housing is built in an area, it becomes no longer controversial. So the Thompson Mobility Program was splashed all across the headlines of the Sun with all kinds of uproar, several times. But in the end, 4,300 families utilized vouchers to move to suburban communities and outer city communities. And most people in the Baltimore region don't even know it happened. So I always say, to elected officials, just push through it and just do it because it won't be controversial afterwards.
Thank you so much. I want to say first in closing that the quality of this panel, this discussion, the ideas and the people that were on it was obviously inspiring because we've had dozens of questions tonight. And unfortunately, as a moderator, my apologies to those in attendance that I could only take a half a dozen or more of those questions. What an incredible and stimulating discussion this has been. I want to thank first Lawrence Lanahan for your incredible work in your book. And thank you so much for appearing and being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. I want to thank Nicole Smith. Thank you so much for being with us tonight and telling your story and being a part of the book.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
Incredible thanks as well to Barbara Samuels. Thank you for all of the work that you've done in our community and state as part of the ACLU of Maryland and in your personal work. Thank you. And Adria Crutchfield, wonderful to meet you, and what incredible work that you're doing assisting families with affordability and housing. And again, I was personally impressed with the work that you're doing to destigmatize vouchers with owners and to help owners take on more vouchers and more residents and help find homes. Well done, and thanks to you and your organization. Dana, Vickers, Shelly, thank you to the ACLU of Maryland, your partnership tonight. It was absolutely fantastic to work with you and your team, Ellen Hutton and Jenny Trust. What a great group to work with. And final thanks to our colleagues at the University of Baltimore, my colleague Cynthia Opakunle, our incredible team in the UB-OTS. Jared, thank you so much for helping us put on this event. Tonight was spectacular. Thanks to everyone that attended. I was told there were over 100 of you tonight, and we'll get final totals on that. This event has been recorded, and we will be in touch soon about how we would like to release it in partnership with the ACLU of Maryland and the University of Baltimore. To all, I wish we could continue. I would like to have stayed on for another 2 hours myself, but thank you so much. Have a wonderful night, and thanks again for being with us.
Thank you, everybody. I can't wait to
Thank
see
you
you all in
for
person.
coming, everybody.
Can't wait